Chapter 28, Prelude. Look, if he didn't want to be fed to my acid-spewing crocodiles, he shouldn't have brought me bad news. Dread Emperor Malignant II, the particularly petty. It'd been a while since I'd had a proper Callowan breakfast. Egg, sausage, and black pudding with a generous portion of buttered bread. The accompanying pot of tea was poor fare compared to the fancy brews my officers, Asia in particular, who carried a stash imported from across the sea even on campaign, but the taste was pleasantly familiar. Tea wasn't grown in Callow. It had to be imported from the free cities and Asher, the cheap stuff from Nicky being most popular. Mercantes was said to hitch up the price on the way north, but no less should be expected from the city of bought and sold. I'd woken before dawn and gotten out of room the very moment I could, slipping away from the personal guard that attempted to follow me without a second thought. Tired of Legion fare, I'd sought a Callowan inn and ignored the scared looks the innkeeper kept shooting me as I ordered. Service was prompt and the fare hearty, though I was starting to get irritated at the skittishness of the innkeeper and her husband. They didn't seem to recognize me at least, which was refreshing. People had this unpleasant tendency to get deferential around me these days, but the distance here was because of my Legion armor and not my station. The only local who didn't jump at my every twitch was a young, dark-haired girl who couldn't be more than 7, peeking curiously at me from behind tables. Her parents had yet to notice her, apparently. I smiled at her while sipping at my mug of tea, and she trotted up to me, sliding on the bench across the table. "I'm Lily," she gabbled. "Hello, Lily," I replied with a smile. "I'm Kat." She nodded seriously, then scrunched up her nose. "Are you a Diorath?" "Lily," the innkeeper suddenly barked, "get off that bench right this instant." "It's all right," I said, waving away the objection. "It's a quiet morning. I wouldn't mind a little company." Lily glared. "I'm not little, I'm 6, she informed me. I smothered a grin. Her mother seemed rather horrified at the idea of the child talking with me, but she seemed even more afraid to offend me by yanking Lily away from the table and hiding her away. She ended up hovering around the table before taking a seat next to her daughter after seeking wordless permission from me, clutching her offspring tightly. Lily tried to wiggle out to no avail. "I'm half-blooded, I think," I told the little girl. "I'm a little too pale for both my parents having been from the people." The child blinked. "How can you not know?" "Don't be rude to patrons, Lily," the innkeeper said with the mechanical promptness of many repetitions. "Not everybody knows their mum and dad like you." "That's sad," the daughter said, patting my hand for comfort. The mother looked panicked, but the tension loosened a bit after it became obvious I'd taken no offense. "I'm used to it," I shrugged. "Life at the orphanage wasn't bad. I've seen people have much rougher childhoods." I'd never realized quite how privileged I'd been to get an education, and 3 meals a day, until my first forays into the Lakeside district. There were people there who spent their days on backbreaking labor and barely made enough to put food on the table. The only difference the conquest had made there was that Mazis, hunger for gold, had driven ever more people to live in the wretched slums as their businesses went under. It would take years to undo the damage he'd done to the city's economy. "You're Callowan then," the innkeeper said, tone puzzled. "I'd heard some of the soldiers in this legion are." Fear flashed through her eyes when she realized she'd used a rather familiar tone. "No disrespect was meant, ma'am," she added hastily. "I've never been easy to offend," I told her dryly. "And after dealing with wasteland nobility, it's a rather welcome change not to have to look for double meanings everywhere." "You've met nobles," Lily breathed out excited. "What were they like?" "Most of them deserve to end up in a crocodile pit," I replied frankly. "But there are some who aren't bad people." Lily had responded to the mention of crocodiles by making vaguely reptilian noises and pretend biting her mother's arms, much to the woman's dismay. "I waved at the Countess once," the child told me when she got bored. "She didn't wave back, though." I snorted. Well, she's had a busy year. Rebellions didn't spawn out of thin air. Most likely she'd been sitting on a plan for years, keeping her moves innocuous enough that my teacher's agents wouldn't pick up on them. People say she's going to be queen, Lily informed me. She's engaged to a duke and everything. I smiled mirthlessly. That only happens if she wins the rebellion, Lily. And I wouldn't count on it. That was, apparently, a little too close to home for her mother. The child was ushered away, told to go help her father make her breakfast. She muttered something about hating porridge and scampered off, though not before waving me goodbye. I waved back bemusedly. To my surprise, the innkeeper remained seated across from me. "Ma'am, I don't mean to pry, but," she started. "Ask," I replied. "If it's restricted information, I won't tell you, but there's no harm in asking." There were a few threads of gray in the woman's hair, but the color of it and the shape of her face was the same as her daughter's. I could see the resemblance if I cared to look. She screwed up her courage after a moment. "Is it true about the demon in the hills?" she said. I grimaced. "Yes. It was kept bound in some sort of temple, but someone let it loose. And we'll have a reckoning for that, won't we, heiress?" That much I would swear oath to, and the longer that debt went unpaid, the longer the price would be when I collected. "But the 15th will stay to protect the city," she pressed. "Orders came down from the top on the matter," I replied, hiding my amusement. The innkeeper let out a sound of relief. "The Legion has behaved well for an army. You don't drink as much as the exiled prince's men did." I very much doubted that, considering the priestly relationship with spirits, but Juniper had likely given orders to keep the drinking out of sight. I'd heard there were a few incidents, I probed. "There were scuffles," she admitted. "Some of the older men say it's all the Empire's fault." They were technically correct, I had to admit. "That tall orc, the one they call Deadhand, he stopped it before it got out of hand," the innkeeper continued. "And Tribune Ratface has been making rounds to see the people displaced by the goblins are properly fed. It's bought a lot of goodwill with those of us who remember the last war. Armies are not easy guests no matter who they obey to." "Well now, Supply Tribune." I hadn't seen much of him lately, since he wasn't needed for most war councils, but it was pleasing to hear he'd been keeping busy. "He's a good sort, Ratface." I spoke over the rim of my tea mug. "You one of his then?" the innkeeper asked. "Something like that," I replied vaguely. She clearly recognized the non-answer for what it was and did not pursue the subject. Apparently the fact that I'd yet to ask for her head had qualified me as not a monster, because there was precious little fear in the older woman now. "I suppose it helps you have a Calawan in charge of the Legion," she decided, then turned a curious eye on me. "You ever met her, the squire?" "A few times," I agreed. "Doesn't seem proper to have one of us a villain," she said. "But it may not be a bad thing, you get my meaning. If the Empire's going to stick around, we might as well have a voice in the tower. Heard she helped hang Mazis, so she can't be all evil. Nasty piece of work, that man." "And how did you hear that, I wonder?" There'd only been a handful of people there that night, and only one of them had the means to spread rumors that far and that quickly. I resisted the urge to clench my fingers. "What are you up to, Black?" Every time I thought I'd sketched out his endgame, something else cropped up to put the design into doubt. "He got what was coming to him," I agreed softly. The front door was suddenly forced open, and the innkeeper immediately flinched back, rising to her feet. I cast a look and saw the 15th had finally caught up. Lieutenant Tordes and a handful of orcs snapped a salute as soon as they saw me. "Lieutenant," I greeted her, spearing the last of the now-cold sausage and taking a bite. "Lady Squire," she replied, fist over heart. "I apologize for disturbing your breakfast, but a war council has been convened." I heard the gasp from the innkeeper when my identity was revealed, but did not bother to turn. I put down the remains of the sausage and finished my tea before sliding 2 golden orelei on the table, over 15 times what the meal was worth. But what did coin really mean to me these days? I glanced at the graying woman. "When the enemy is sighted," I told her, Take your family to the center of the city. It'll be the safest place. I passed Tordy's by and stepped into the morning light. I'd been under for 2 days, but my officers had not been idle. I'd yet to take a look at the outer defenses, but as we made for the council I saw that Juniper had ordered a second set of walls further in, though walls was perhaps too ambitious of a word. A ring of houses had been collapsed to form a citadel inside Marchford, the stone and wood stacked as a makeshift barricade already manned by legionaries. The Countess' manor was long abandoned, too removed from the rest of the city to be defensible. The people left bereft of a home by my sapper's work had been packed in taverns, inns, and the houses of relatives willing to put them up. Still, central Marchford was densely packed. The main avenues were kept clear by patrols so that deployments would not be hindered when the battle started, though eyes were peeking at us through blindfolds all the way through. Juniper had picked a large guild hall as the headquarters for the 15th, clearing out the occupants and nailing most opening shuts with wooden planks. The central hall was bustling with my legate's men, reports coming in and orders coming out every few moments. Close to the wall in the back, a pair of tables had been forced together to accommodate maps and seat all of the general staff, most of which, I saw, was missing. Nock and Hune were there, as the highest-ranked officers after the Hellhound, and so were Hakriam and Pickler. No sign of Killian and Ratface, or even Aisha. I dismissed Lieutenant Tordy's absent-mindedly, my attention already on the conversation to come. If so many were elsewhere, then something had happened requiring their direct attention. That both Killian and Apprentice were absent was telling in and of itself. Nock eyed my bad leg with a frown but held his tongue as I made my way up to the others, keeping my pace steady so the limp wouldn't be too obvious. I had a feeling tapping into my name would allow me to power through the pain if I ever needed to run, but for daily life, I might well have to take up Mazigo's offer of herbs to take the edge off. Or start taking my drinking more seriously. I'm guessing we have a situation, I spoke up, disinclined to indulge in small talk. The enemy has been sighted, Commander Hune spoke in that incongruously delicate voice of hers. The Silver Spears, I asked. The last report I'd read had made it clear the devils were out there, though they'd yet to make a move. Juniper wouldn't have sought me out unless the situation had changed more than that. They'll be on us by nightfall, Nock growled. The bastards finally arrived. Nightfall, huh? I supposed it'd be too much to hope whatever corruption the mercenaries had gone through wouldn't allow them to see in the dark. When had I ever been that lucky? I glanced at the maps on the table, then frowned. There was half a dozen scrying bowls scattered in a half-circle around where Juniper stood. I tapped the rim of the one closest to me, then cast an eye on the Hellhound. I thought the demon scrambled scrying. The grim-faced orc bared her teeth. Apprentice's threshold ritual changed things. As long as the point of origin and the point of reception are under the ritual's aegis, our mages can the simplest versions of the spell. Useful that would allow my legate to react immediately to changes on the battlefield, if I grasped her intent correctly. There'd been no time to set up that sort of fanciness when we'd first taken on the Silver Spears, but defending a city was a different sort of business. Are we ready? I finally asked, because what else could I say? I've spent most of my time setting up our kill zone, Pickler smiled unpleasantly, spindly fingers tracing the rectangle I'd told Mazigo to leave out of his ritual. When the devils come, they will be warmly received. I nodded. And the spears? They'll go through the west, Juniper grunted. Quickest way to get to a hearth, and that's what they'll be aiming for. There's a wider avenue where their horse will be able to charge properly. I'll be waiting for them there, Nock spat, and his fists tightened hard enough the knuckles popped. We'll have to concentrate our forces on the mercenaries, Hune spoke. If the devils get loose in the city, our entire defense will collapse. Then I'll be dealing with the devils, I murmured. No sign of surprise from anyone. I suppose that had been a rather obvious fit for me. Takes a monster to kill a monster, doesn't it? Robber will be commanding the sappers assigned to that sector, Pickler informed me. You'll have his full cohort. You'll get another company to follow you when the swords come out, Juniper growled. We haven't settled on which one. Words was put out, Hakram told me. 7 different companies volunteered. I have the list if you want to take a look. Don't need it, I replied. I'm taking the forlorn hope. That finally got a reaction. Is that wise, Lady Squire? Commander Hune asked, her buckler-sized palm resting on the table. Deserters are not known for their ability to hold under pressure, and that part of the battlefield will be the most brutal. She means they could put a knife in your ribs and leg it if things look bad enough. Pickler spoke more frankly. This is the very kind of situation I formed the company for, I replied. If they can't be used, they should be hanged. I'd spoken calmly and without raising my voice, but I could see several of them repressing the urge to move back. I smiled mirthlessly. One of these days, Precy would learn to stop thinking that mercy and ruthlessness were mutually exclusive. I'd made the forlorn hope with the intent of deploying it in battle. If it could not be deployed, it could return to the gallows I'd snatched it from. There were only so many chances I was willing to give people. That's settled then, Adjutant said, shutting the door on the topic. We have one last issue to address. Archer has yet to take a stance on whether or not she'll participate. Said she'll only talk with you, Juniper spat, clearly disgruntled. Not much of a diplomat, that one. I didn't bother to specify which woman the statement was meant for, since it could easily go both ways. I'll handle it, I said, nothing else. The hellhound shook her head. I almost walked out, but forced myself to stay a moment longer. Luck in battle, I told my officers. Luck is for amateurs, Juniper replied with bared teeth. I have a plan. If there was ever to be a motto for the 15th, I decided that would be it. I have a plan. Watch how it goes south. Archer was on a rooftop, because named were inevitably afflicted with a deep thirst for melodrama. Foot on the ledge, she looked in the distance where a cloud of dust revealed the silver spears were getting closer. I hoisted myself up through the trapdoor and waited for her to acknowledge my presence, sighing when it became clear she wouldn't. Out of morbid curiosity, I cleared my throat, just to see how far she'd be willing to push the farce. Fluidly, the woman turned, and a flash of silver was the only warning I got. The throwing knife had been placed expertly, spinning in a trajectory that would see it bury straight in my throat. Without missing a beat, I snatched it out of air. You can throw faster than that, I said. I can, Archer agreed, finally bothering to face me. But this is still slightly swifter than a mundane mortal could manage. She'd been checking how much my name had been affected by my latest debacle. Fair enough, even if this was an idiot way to go about it. I'm told you won't talk with my legate, I grunted. I don't speak terms with minions, she replied easily. Maybe if I'd had an easier fortnight, I would have been politer about it, but my well of patience was running pretty dry. Legate, I corrected flatly. She's my legate. Regardless, here I am. Have you made a decision? If anything, my abruptness seemed to amuse her. My irritation ratcheted up a knot in response. While your battle is not unworthy, is it not mine? She shrugged. Hunter and I will leave when enemy assaults the city. We'll kill a few on the way out of politeness. Fine, I grunted. Making my way down the trapdoor was going to be a goddamned pain, but jumping down into the street would probably be worse. I turned to leave. Not going to try to convince me? Archer asked, mildly surprised. I shot her an aggravated look. I don't have the time or the patience for this kind of game, I said. You'll fight or you won't. I get the feeling not much I'll say will tip the balance either way. Considering the corner you're in, the ochre-skinned woman spoke, are you sure you can afford not to? I couldn't help it, I laughed, right in her face. The look of incredulity that got me was a memory that would warm me on cold nights. I'm always in a fucking corner, Archer, I told her. I don't think I've been in a fight where I wasn't horribly outclassed since I can remember. I spread my arms and turned the palms up, encompassing all of the city. And yet I'm still here, standing, I said softly. So scuttle off if you want to. I don't need you to make this a victory. I leaned forward and flashed her a hard smile. You think one less aspect and a limp is going to stop me? I don't win fights because I'm the squire. I win them because I'm Catherine Foundling. Watch them take a swing. See where it gets them. Book 2 Interlude, Greenskins. The Karsam word for war is derived from the one used for a full cookpot. That tells you everything you need to know about how the clans think of creation. Extract from Horrors and Wonders, famed travelogue of Anabas the Assyrian. That was a mistake, Lieutenant Balker offered. It got worse, Captain Clipper suggested instead, flirtatiously allowing her teeth to peek through her chops. She did have superb canines, Robber was forced to admit, but she was no pickler. It was his curse to always be interested in the unattainable ones he'd found, and the senior sapper was as unattainable as it got. A rock-breaker tribe boy like him, with the direct daughter of a matron line. That was the punchline to a joke about overreaching, not a plan of action. Unlike humans, the tribes didn't glorify people trying to love above their social stature. They buried them in shallow graves. And for all that the 15th was not the Grey Iris, there would always be that invisible line there. He'd long made his peace with that. You're all amateurs, he told his minions. And no, that wasn't another suggestion. Clearly we should be going with I can't believe that worked. There was a murmur of approval from the ranks, though some filthy traitorous elements dissented. Fear the goats, someone called out, the one true motto of the 15th. Captain Borer, the Tribune addressed his second-in-command loudly, write up that man for insubordination and poor taste. Borer was one of his very favorite people in creation, simply because the other goblin had no sense of humor whatsoever. Probably because he was Deep Pit tribe. That whole bunch breathed in all sorts of nasty stuff when they were young. Borer squinted at the traitor, then sighed. That's a woman, sir, the captain told him, Lieutenant Rattler. You sure? Robber asked, cocking his head to the side. That's clearly a man's nose. Rattler flipped him off. Add to the list that she was emotionally hurtful, the yellow-eyed goblin added without missing a beat, grinning at the wave of jeers that got. Running a sapper cohort wasn't like leading regulars. For one, sappers were all insane. You had to willingly choose a career path that would see you deal with notoriously volatile munitions on a daily basis. There was also the fact that they were the mostly lightly armed soldiers in the legions of terror, yet regularly saw action on the front lines. That was fine because leading crazy people, in Robber's opinion, was a lot like being in prison. If you wanted your authority unquestioned, you had to walk up to the biggest prisoner on the cell block, rip out their eyes, and make a necklace out of them. Metaphorically speaking. So far, anyway, a whistle came from further ahead, lilting and then going high. Enemy in sight. You hear that, ladies and gentlemen? The yellow-eyed Tribune called out. That's the sound fun makes when it begins. He saw more than a few sappers shiver in eager anticipation. Crazy, the lot of them. So let me hear it before you get to battle positions, he called out. What's the operational creed of this cohort? Kill THEM, take their stuff. The call came back. Robber faked wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. Considering goblins didn't even have tear ducts, the absurdity was delightful. Go forth, my minions, he cackled. Our guests have arrived, Aisha said. Juniper could see the devils trickling in through the scrying bowl herself. Foundling's assessment of how many she'd killed seemed roughly accurate. A quick headcount put the enemy at around 80. Most of them were the smaller types she did reports on, the iron-clawed creatures with fur and a swarm of fireflies. The larger ones would be more dangerous, given their ability to shrug off crossbow bolts, but Pickler's traps had been designed specifically to deal with their kind. The legate looked away from the bowl and absent-mindedly adjusted the figurine representing Squire and her forlorn hope. It had moved a little to the left of the accurate spot when someone had jostled the table. Word from the west, the hellhound asked. The enemy hasn't engaged, the mage overlooking that particular bowl informed her. The grim-faced orc repressed the urge to sigh. Humans, she thought unkindly. I'm aware of that, she said. What do the silver spears look like, Sergeant? How were they modified by the corruption? The man frowned, peering into the softly glowing water. God's below, he said, looking nauseous. You should take a look yourself. Juniper stepped closer, elbowing the sergeant aside. The mage on the other side of the scrying spell was holding up a mirror pointed at the enemy, standing on the roof of a house beyond the sapper-built wall. What the sorcery revealed was troubling. The men-at-arms had been visibly mutated, growing cysts of flesh filled with dark pus. Some had eyes blinking from all over their faces, or even their hands, though the most disgusting of it was the way their bodies now overflowed their armor. The cataphracts were cleaner, but somehow that made it worse. Their silvery armor looked like it had melted shut, and there was no delineation where the man ended and the horse began. The mounts themselves looked sickly, and the hair over their skin was largely gone, patches of flesh falling away from their flanks in long strings. The spell focused on the cataphract at the head of the pack, whose helm had been twisted in a sordid, unmoving metal grin. The mage shivered at her side, but the hellhound remained unmoved. That last cataphract seemed a likely candidate for the leader of the host, though how led the silver spears still was debate. Worth making a priority target, but not launching a specific assault to take out. She doubted morale would be an issue for the former mercenaries, as far gone as they were. Unfortunate that the usual shock and awe tactics that were the Legion's bread and butter wouldn't work, but this could lend advantage in other ways. If the minds of the silver spears were affected, they were unlikely to be able to manage sophisticated battle tactics. Bait and switch will be effective. The legate calmly put her orders through the spell and waited for a messenger on the other side of the city to carry them to Nock. Foundling's insistence that the orc commander be the one handling the front with the mercenaries had come as an unpleasant surprise, though she understood the internal politics driving it. Squire was still whipping herself over the death of Nilin, she decided, and so hadn't had the heart to refuse Nock's request. Hune would have been a better fit. She was a cold blood, Juniper suspected, much like she'd once thought Hakram was. Incapable of anything but the shallowest of emotions, unmoved by fear, and with natural assertiveness. Had the ogre been anything but a legionary, that would have made her very dangerous indeed, but as an officer of the 15th that meant she could be relied on not to lose her head. Nock had too much of a temper, much like her own mother. Though mother does not sink into the red rage when displeased. Still, for all that the other orc was a skilled commander and cleverer than he looked. Or acted sometimes. With the specter of Foundling's disapproval driving him, he should manage to keep himself in line. The parts of Hune's cavalry that hadn't been assigned to him would remain posted in strategic locations as a quick deployment reserve, ready to plug in gaps when they inevitably arose. She'd spent days and nights going over the contingencies for this fight. You're smiling again, Aisha observed. Was she? The hellhound wiped her face clean of emotion. The dark-skinned aristocrat that served as her second-in-command and closest friend snorted. It's still in your eyes, she said, the thirst. Had anybody else been speaking to her this way, she could have harshly chided them. I have no such thing, Juniper replied gruffly, knowing it was a lie. It came from her mother's blood, she was sure of it, that deep, dark part of her that looked upon the battlefield and bared its fangs in joy. General Istrid was famous for being one of the only Presi generals who fought in the ranks, and while the hellhound believed that Marshal One-Eye's way was best, there was a trace of that hunger in her. She dedicated her whole life to the art of war because there was something in her that sang, when she gave orders and the arrow loosed by her mind found the enemy's throat. Orcs are born in love with death, the old saying went, and what mortal lover could possibly compare? That was the boon and the curse of her people. Gods forgive her, but she was almost grateful to Eris for having laid out such a fine banquet in front of the 15th. When Juniper was done sinking her teeth into the Battle of Marchford, the blood spilled would splatter all over the pages of history. This she knew in her bones, like she knew there was no after the war for people like her. Just one battlefield after another, until she went out in a glorious bloody mess that would shake the pillars of the very heavens. Some part of her looked forward to that end, but it would not be today. Her quiver was still full. "The sappers have engaged the enemy," Aisha conveyed. The hellhound smiled and knocked her arrow. The bolt took the devil in the eye and it screamed. This wasn't one of the smaller ones, so a good shot would do little more than tickle it, unfortunately. The beast looked like the particularly dumb offspring of a bull and gazelle, if both of those creatures had been morbidly obese. All in all, it was the size of a supply wagon and seemed intent on acting like a living battering ram. "You really let yourself go, buddy," Robert informed it. "You should be ashamed of yourself." He scuttled off inside the nearest house as another crossbow volley picked off a pair of the iron-hooked devils. He'd earlier thought that taking one of the ugly bastards in the head would kill them, but when the first volley had failed to make a single kill, he'd been roughly disabused of the notion. Fill them with enough bolts, though, and they stopped moving. The horned devil bellowed and charged after him, ripping through the door he'd slammed shut behind him like it was made of wet clay. Cheerfully, the yellow-eyed tribune threw some poor soul's good tea set at the thing and legged it towards the window, jumping through and landing in a roll on the street as the shutters came apart. "Bring it down," he ordered the two sappers awaiting. The hammers fell with unseemly enthusiasm, breaking the keystones Pickler had marked and weakened a few days back. The house collapsed on top of the devil. It probably wasn't dead yet, unfortunately, since the roof had been mere thatch. Robert casually lit a pinewood match as the other two sappers threw oil jugs on the rough location of the monster, setting the whole thing aflame without missing a beat. "How's the main street?" he asked. "Demolition charges took one of the big fuckers out when it tried to pursue," Lieutenant Rattler told him, wiping her hands clear of the oil. "Callowin made those jugs. Sloppy work. If they hadn't confiscated them from local stocks, he would have complained about the quality. He still would, of course, but he'd have done it more if the 15th had actually paid for them." There was the pop of a sharper detonating in the distance, the sound of an iron-hooked devil getting blown off a roof by his lovely minions. Goblins knew the passage of time more intimately than any human or orc could, and the Tribune knew he'd been lingering where he stood too long. Already devils were honing in on his position, the dark failing to hide their silhouettes from his night vision. "On to the next choke point," he ordered, casting one last look at the burning wreck. This little kip of theirs was the brainchild of Pickler and the Hellhound, goblin engineering married to the steel trap that was their legate's mind. Give ground one block after another, bleeding them dry all the way as they tore themselves to pieces going through the traps. Pickler's love letter to the Sapper Corps, he liked to think of it. And who was he to refuse such a heartfelt confession? "Shield wall," Knock of the Waxing Moons ordered. Clan names didn't mean much here, where the true clan was the number on the Legion standard they fought under. His ancestry still followed him, though, the rage always whispering in his ears and waiting for an opening to take hold of him. It had gotten stronger since his brother's death, fed on the grief and anger to become an even more ill-begotten thing. But there would no anger today. He would take his revenge the Precy way, cold and patient and utterly absolute. Knock had thought orcs ruthless once, for they took lives the way other races took breath. He'd learned better since. The tower was built on blood and hatred, a monument paved with 100,000 lives sacrificed at the altar of boundless ambition. How could a few corpses strewn across the steps ever compare? Knock of the Waxing Moons wanted to sink his teeth into the enemy's flesh and feed until his belly was full, but Commander Knock of the 15th Legion would remain where he stood and see the silver spears ripped out root and stem. Another pyre for Nilin, one whose screams would be heard all the way to the underworld. The legionaries spread across the street and knelt as they put down their scutum against the cobblestones, spears jutting out in anticipation of the charge of the damned. 3 rows of longer spears from the men behind them bolstered the wall, his legionaries calmly watching the cataphracts form in the field. The legions of terror were no match for the heavy phalanxes used by the free cities, but they had suffered the charges of Calawan knights for centuries and learned from the defeats. The reforms had formalized the infrequent tactics some past Black Knights had used to good effect against the Order of the White Hand, standardizing the formation into the 4 rows of spear the legions now used against cavalry. Horses usually refused to charge a wall of spears unless they were trained destriers, but the mounts of the silver spears had been raised for war even before the demon had gotten its hooks into them. They would charge Nock knew. He was counting on it. Filthy abominations, Senior Tribune J. Wahir spoke with distaste. The Tagreb woman narrowed her almond-shaped eyes at the silver spears, resting a hand on the pommel of her sword. Half the reason Nock had promoted her to Senior Tribune was that she had nothing in common whatsoever with her predecessor, whether it be in gender, race, or even general disposition. Even in the light cast by the torches and bonfires covering the entire front, that much was obvious. "Soon to be dead ones," Commander Nock growled. "They're taking too long to form up. J. Wahir, send them an invitation." The tawny-skinned officer raised a hand, and the legionary behind her hoisted a banner. There was a rustle of movement behind them as 200 goblins raised their crossbows, aimed and let the quarrels loose. Most of the monster cataphracts were out of range, in Nock's estimation, but the tip of their formation lingered close to effective killing range. The projectiles fell in an arc and most of them ate dirt, but a handful of cavalrymen took hits. No kills, the commander assessed. Whatever demon buggery had mixed man and horseflesh had made it so that not even a headshot was enough to kill the abominations. "Tell the hellhound we'll likely have to put down the horses to kill the horsemen," he told the mage hovering behind him. The bolts might have been mere flea bites, but they served their intended purpose. The silver spears were on the move. The damned mercenaries had placed their host as a mirror of his own, more or less. His own men were spread across the makeshift wall save for the main avenue the sappers had kept clear, where his cohort of 4 deep spearmen held the ground from one side of the open ground to the other. Behind them he'd placed his sappers, though these ones were without munitions. Fucking robbers group had gotten what remained of those to deal with the devils. The monster cataphracts faced his spears, all 300 of them, while they'd split their infantry into 2 groups of 250 on the sides. The men-at-arms moved first, charging forward without so much as a word. "Mages," Commander Nock barked, "fire." Balls of flame bloomed all over the rampart, and the Battle of Marchford began in earnest. "They're facing our spears with their horse," Juniper observed, frowning. Aisha drummed her fingers against the table. "Could be the corruption scrambled their brains more than we thought," she said. Neither of the 2 women expected the legate to reply. The hellhound spoke aloud to focus her thoughts. Aisha's contribution was to serve as a sounding board by throwing around ideas to be adopted or dismissed. "They have a surprise up their sleeves," the grim-faced orc decided. "Have Hune prepare the first fallback point." The dark-skinned staff tribune drifted away to see it done. The hellhound glanced at the latest report from the southern front, which had that little wretch robber's casualties already nearing the 40s. Not a sign of incompetence, though an untrained observed might have thought as much. She'd predicted heavier casualties when projecting the numbers for the engagement. A running battle through streets and alleys against devils was going to be a butchery, one way or another. The insolent twerp did have an almost providential sense of when to push and when to fold, though, which was why she hadn't protested when the goblin had been nominated for the action in the first place. There were few officers in the 15th who'd be able to see their cohort split in half a dozen smaller forces and not lose track of most of them. Yet, aside from a line getting stuck in a dead end and slaughtered to a man, the yellow-eyed tribune had managed to keep casualties to a minimum. "Good. We don't have the men to spare." Marchford, she'd grasped early, would be as much a battle of attrition as one of tactics. The 15th could field a little above 1,000 men, 400 of which were sappers. Goblin munition stocks were half empty from 3 hills, and there wasn't enough goblin fire left to deploy in any significant matter. Not that she could, since it was likely to collapse Apprentice's ritual. What she did have was one of the legions of terror, arguably the finest infantry force to ever grace Calurnia. That her forces were heavy on sappers was a minor liability, particularly in a siege setting. If she'd had only a single cohort of them, she'd not have managed half as many preparations as she had. What did the enemy have? 80-odd devils, most of which she could and had planned for. The threshold ritual had allowed her to dictate where they would enter the city, which simplified the matter even more. 800 corrupted silver spears, an unspecified amount of which would be cavalry, 300 as it turned out. In the upper reaches of the scenarios she'd planned for, the success margin for a retreat would be uncomfortably thin. In most sieges, cavalry wouldn't have been a factor at all, and Pickler had suggested pulling down a few houses to fortify the main avenue into the west of city, the one linking to the road into broader Callow. It was an obvious weak point, after all. Even the 15th had taken it when seizing the city. Yet Juniper had refused. If that gap was plugged, there was no telling where the silver spears would strike. The tactical disadvantage it gave her was worth the strategic asset of being able to prepare a specific point for static defense. Robbers entering the last stretch, Aisha told her, having reappeared at some point. Good, Juniper growled. Let's tidy up this empire. I've come to a realization, Captain Clipper, Robber panted, casting a look into the alley. Shit. Still a bunch of the fireflies and that scaled tiger monster that had ripped a man's head right off. And what would that realization be, Tribune Robber? The captain replied, loading her lever-action crossbow. The yellow-eyed miscreant cast another wary look into the alley. Where the hells were his crossbowmen? At this rate they'd arrive too late. Well, let's change this around a bit. I'm actually invincible, he told the younger goblin, offering a vicious grin. Truly, I've been ignoring the evidence for too long. It's the only explanation that makes sense. Oh gods, the captain moaned. She watched with horror as he checked his gear one last time, cleared his throat, and ran out into the alley screaming at the top of his lungs. There were 5 devils in there, and they paused for a moment at the sight of him. They were, he supposed, used to people running in the opposite direction. Well, this is awkward, the Goblin Tribune said, slowly unsheathing said blade with his right hand. I was aiming for that other alley, the one without all the devils in it. Do over. The scaled tiger glanced at the fireflies, then again at him. A heartbeat later, it had already crossed half the distance, separating it from the Tribune. I hope you bastards have eyes, Robber spoke at the fireflies, tossing the bright stick he'd lit with his good hand while keeping them looking at the other. The munition blew up right in the scaled tiger's face, but he didn't stick around to find out what happened. Clipper should have gotten moving while he was distracting them, so he legged it as fast as he could. Mage takers, he discovered a moment later when one expanded into a pale-skinned silhouette with a wet squelch, did not actually have eyes. There went like half his arsenal. Still, he'd not made it this long in the legions without stabbing a few people in dark alleys where no one could see him. Allegedly, he rammed his short sword through the devil's stomach, spun around, and deftly planted his good knife in its neck. Well, Hakram's good knife probably isn't very good anymore, he decided. That blood looks pretty nasty. Still, being the exemplary friend that he was, he took the filthy murder knife, forced his sword out, and ran for the next choke point. If there'd been no crossbowmen for this one, it meant some of his sappers had gotten their idiot skulls caved in. Hellhound would get snippy about it, no doubt. He ran down the street and turned the corner without slowing down, sliding on the blood-slick cobblestone and reflexively dropping to the ground when he heard a goblin's voice yell, "Duck!" A hail of very late crossbow bolts passed overhead, puncturing the scaled tiger's body 6 times. The devil twitched, then dropped. Robber carefully picked up a loose pavement stone and threw it at the monster's head. It did not react. Nodding to himself, the Tribune wiped some of the black blood off his face and took a look at his saviors, Rattler's boys, though not from the 10th he'd been expecting. That had unfortunate implications. First, I'm claiming full credit for this kill, he announced. One of the sappers reloaded his crossbow and eyed his kidney area thoughtfully as the others loudly protested. It just warmed his heart that someone was keeping the old tradition of goblin field promotion alive. Second, he spoke over their treasonous winging. Where are the others? You're the last, sir, the shady one with the loaded crossbow said. Captain Clipper just came through. The others are getting the reception ready. Robber casually flicked dirt off his shoulder, smearing twice as blood over in the process. Well, gentlemen, let's get moving, he ordered. As soon as you all thank me for saving your pitiful lives from that monster anyway. No wonder their infantry hadn't thought twice about charging a wall, Nock thought as he watched another man-at-arms jump 10 feet high and land on top of the fortification. The warrior was immediately caught in the chest by a burst of mage fire and went back down without so much as a sound, but others had managed to establish a foothold. The fuckers fought better than they had before the demon had touched them, fearless and immune to pain. His men on the walls were taking a mauling, even with mage lines backing them. Still, they were holding. By the edge of their teeth, they were holding. The orc commander didn't have any more time to grant the situation on the walls, because the enemy cavalry had finally stirred. They started at a walk, then a trot, and fell into a gallop 20 yards before reaching his line. At that point, the ground gave under them, revealing the trick ditch Pickler's lot had dug just for the lot of them. The full first rank went under, but the rest pushed through with their lances up. That was when the crossbow volley hit them. Killed few enough, but it slowed them some before they rammed into his spearmen. Still, the crash of steel against steel was deafening. Shit, Senior Tribune Jaywaher spoke feelingly, as they both watched the first line of their formation collapse under rampaging hooves. Line steady, Nock disagreed, watching his legionaries waver and then solidify their formation. Shock cavalry like lancers was good for exactly that, shock. After the initial impact, they were just men on horses with an unwieldy weapon. Legionaries pulled down riders when they could and killed the horses when they could not, doing their grisly work in the dirt and blood under the torchlight. A messenger came from his back and leaned forward to speak quietly. Legate Juniper orders a retreat, sir, the man said. Now, Nock started, then frowned. The Hellhound didn't give orders without reason, and she'd be well aware that he'd bleed men every step falling back to the next stronghold. Sound the retreat, he told Jaywaher. Before she could, though, a sharp uptick in screams drew his attention. The center of his spearmen was being blown through like leaves, though calling cavalry what was achieving that would have been a misnomer. Some great hulking beast made of what must have been at least 5 horses, and as many riders intertwined in a grotesque embrace, was rampaging across the formation, picking men off with spears and ripping at them with too many hungry mouths. Nock unsheathed his sword, pushing down the swell of rage that ran through his veins. Sound the fucking retreat, Jaywaher, he barked. We're pulling back. The Hellhound slowly sat down in the armchair someone had provided her when they'd taken the guild hall, but that she was only now using for the first time. She closed her eyes and allowed her fingers to clasp the, admittedly poorly, sculpted arms. She remained there for a long moment, feeling the weight of all her staff's eyes on her. Nock's front is still salvageable, Aisha assessed, and Robber's casualties still aren't as high as our worst-case scenario. Juniper did not answer. She simply allowed the images she'd been glimpsing all night to come together in her mind, forming the pattern of the engagement. Forces in motion, some set by her and others by the enemy. She could see where instinct would drive her opponent, to seek that decisive blow that would knock the 15th out of this battle. And yet, she murmured, fangs glinting in the lamplight. Juniper, Aisha said, what will we do? I'm going to take a nap, Juniper replied. There was a heartbeat of silence. Should I just wake you when the battle's over, then? Her tawny-skinned friend asked sardonically. The Hellhound smiled without opening her eyes. It already is. The armored boot came down and crushed the soldier's sword hand, then came down again and broke the bastard's neck. Nock spat on the abomination and wiped his blooded sword, one of the still blinking grown eye. "In good order, you weak-kneed presses," he growled. His men reacted like the sound of his voice had been a lash, tightening their line as they slowly backed away from the enemy. The Silver Spear's infantry was being a hellish pain, what with the way they ignored battle lines and threw themselves into his formation with their weapons out. He'd ordered his legionaries into the testudo to take the hits, but some scraping of tactics must have remained in the cataphracts, for they'd immediately charged. The first time had cost him a full line before they'd drawn back, and that was without counting their bitch of a trump card. "It's coming again," Jawahir called out, dripping blood through the openings of her helmet. "Mages fire," the commander bellowed. 4 dozen fireballs impacted the massive abomination who'd wrecked his spearmen, blowing it back. It careened into a house, wrecking the wall and slowly getting back to its feet. Only a matter of moments before the cataphracts hit again, Nock knew, but he grinned nastily under his blood-streaked helmet. They were just a corner away from the plaza now, and that meant, just in time, Nock's remaining legionaries fell into position at the head of the alley. The sounds of the cavalry's hoofs against the stone rang as they charged, but they did not impact his men. The ranks split smoothly in two, letting them through to meet the line that had emerged from the plaza. 20 ogres in full plate raised their warhammers and brought them down on the riders, killing man and beast alike in a single stroke. The legionaries closed around the riders as they tried to retreat, taking their revenge for lives already claimed. A cry of warning came that the great beast was coming again, but he was not worried because Pickler, beautiful glorious Pickler, had been the one to build this fallback point. The stone the ballista threw hit the monster right in its center of mass, a textbook-perfect shot. Horse legs and unwary necks broke, though the creature wasn't dead. It crawled forward and Nock strode to it, elbowing aside any legionary in his way. At some point he dropped his shield, but he had no need for it for this kind of work. The soldier closest to the abomination was run through by a spear a heartbeat after he reached the enemy, but the orc did not stop. He felt the red rage welling up in him, like a tide about to tip him over, but he did not fight it. He rode the wave, let its anger strengthen his limbs as he caught a lance about to skewer him and ripped it out of the rider's arm. The hand came with it, but what did he care? In a moment of perfect clarity, Commander Nock saw the hoof about to cave in his chest and howled, ramming his sword in the horse it belonged to. Hands and teeth were grasping at him, but he climbed the abomination until he reached the summit of it. Under him was the roiling nest of corruption, flesh convulsing and pulsing like a repulsive heartbeat. With a laugh of heady battle joy, he plunged the lance into it. Then he ripped it out and did it again as the abomination broke its silence for the first time, screaming through every mouth it had. Again and again he plunged the lance, until finally the monster stopped moving. Rising to his feet, covered in pus and blood, the orc howled at the night sky and the red moon filling it. 700 voices took up the scream, and he bared its teeth and looked down at the remaining silver spears, watching them mass for another assault. Hear that, Nilin? Isn't it better than a pack of mourners at a funeral? Reception Alley, as the planning committee consisting of Robber and everybody within hearing range of him fondly knew it, was a cramped mess of wooden walls and stone foundations that had already looked about to collapse before the sappers got their grubby little hands on it. It was currently filled to the brim with devils trying to push their way through to the goblins shooting at them from the neck of the alley, most of them adding insult to injury with gleeful enthusiasm. He had trained his minions well, the Tribune decided. "Gotta be at least 20 in there," Lieutenant Rattler commented, spitting to the side as they both watched another volley take a jackal-faced devil in the throat. A heartbeat later, another quarrel punctured the thing's crotch with a dull thump. Robber made a mental note of finding out whoever had done that and giving them a commendation. It was the little things that made this career so much fun. "I figure we'll have taken 40 total by the time we're done," the yellow-eyed officer replied. "And taken over twice that in casualties for their trouble, but it just wasn't a party if half the guests weren't dead on the ground by the end of the evening." Another of the mage takers burst in the middle of his men, but it was taken out within moments, long knives plunging into its flesh from every direction. Situational awareness was a natural goblin trait. They wouldn't have lasted very long as a species otherwise, either because of predators or each other. The single mage Juniper had assigned them for the scrying link was in the back and well guarded, though the sight of an orc twice, the size of the goblins watching over him, had been most amusing. Once in a while the fireflies made a play for the man, but it turned out they could be swatted like actual fireflies when they were in that form. Who knew? Well, Apprentice knew, and had told them, which was how they knew. Details. This is as much as we'll manage to sucker in, Robber said. They've got to be making their way around by now. Light them up. The thing about sharpers was that they didn't burn, not exactly. The alchemy, as it had been explained to him, released something called kinetic force, which was obviously a made-up mage word. Still, all the heat that accompanied sharpers blowing came from friction with whatever they hit. You couldn't set something on fire with a sharper. Not on its own, anyway. The only good thing about Marchford he'd found was that one of the main merchant guilds in the city had a great big stock of oil jugs that had been overlooked by the Countess when she'd stripped the city clean of useful stuff before bailing for her rebellion. About 9 out of 10 jugs from that reserve were currently inside the houses making up Reception Alley, along with all the sharpers and smokers they'd been able to put aside. Pickler was more interested in mechanics than munitions, but Robber himself had always been more of an explosion sort of fellow. Kept the blood flowing. So he designed the network of makeshift explosives that dotted the alley himself, and he watched with unholy pleasure as his minions lit up the initial charges and scampered away. One sharp whistle from Robber himself, and all his remaining cohort bylaid, giving ground to the devils who clawed their way in pursuit immediately. The explosion still flattened him. He rose to his feet to witness a burning wasteland of rock and splintered wood, strewn with the cooked corpses of devils. Billows of toxic scalding smoke covered it all, too heavy to rise in the sky even with the wind trying to move them. "I'm a little turned on right now," he admitted. "Aren't we all?" Lieutenant Rattler spoke in a reverent tone. He shook himself out of his reverie after a moment. Silhouettes were already prowling the smoke, hissing in pain but still pushing through. "Full retreat, my lovelies," he called out. Their part in this was done. By now Apprentice should have finished the second part of his ritual, the one that closed the threshold-free rectangle behind the devils. The door to retreat had been shut down, and now they were stuck with a real monster. He almost pitied the poor bastards, stuck in a box with the boss and 100 angry Callowans. Someone was going to have a bad time, and it sure as hells wasn't going to be the boss. 50 yards away from the burning, Catherine Foundling slowly unsheathed her sword.